Within the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Imperium of Man, the concept of a therapist simply does not exist. For the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, the morning shift commenced punctually at 0400 hours, Terran Standard. Sublevel 97's labyrinthine corridors were perpetually bathed in the anemic glow of flickering illuminators, rendering every surface in the sickly hue of aged parchment. The very air itself was a stale cocktail of recycled breath and the acrid metallic tang of fear sweat, a lingering miasma that had seeped into the very stonework over countless decades. Here, deep within the Administratum complex on Mordian Prime, men and women process the wholesale destruction of worlds with the same methodical, dispassionate precision their colleagues 3 floors above employed to catalog trivial grain shipments. Scribe adept Matthias Vaughn had endured this particular shift for 11 grueling years. His designated workspace consisted of a utilitarian metal desk, its surface a testament to countless generations of stylus abuse, positioned directly beneath a solitary overhead illuminator that faithfully pulsed every 43 seconds. To his left sat a data slate displaying the morning's grim queue of planetary assessments. To his right rested a heavy brass stamp, emblazoned with the imperial aquila and the stark words, Exterminatus Authorized, rendered in elegant Gothic script. Between these 2 implements of his trade lay a cup of recaf, long since gone cold, its motionless surface reflecting the pale, shifting light like a dark, silent mirror. The first request of the day originated from the embattled Cadian sector. Planet designation, Helix 7. Its population, 4 billion souls. The reporting officer, a Colonel Vex of the 12th Cadian Shock Troops, detailed a catastrophic outbreak of what field reports definitively classified as Nurgle's rot, virulent and rapidly spreading throughout the primary hive cities. The contamination had already reached an alarming 17% of the planetary population. Imperial protocol unequivocally dictated that anything above 15% contamination required immediate, uncompromising sterilization. Vaughn meticulously read the report 3 times, the sheer numbers swimming before his eyes like a plague of dark insects. 4 billion souls. He consciously avoided contemplating the unimaginable visual scale of 4 billion living beings. Instead, he forced his focus onto the ironclad protocol, 17%. It demonstrably exceeded the established threshold. The calculation was stark, brutally simple. He reached for the stamp. The brass felt icily cold against his palm, its chill permeating even the thin fabric of his work gloves. The stamp descended with a soft, hollow thud that echoed strangely in the otherwise quiet chamber. Another world died, and it was not yet A500 hours. The second request arrived from Segmentum Obscurus concerning the world designated Blackstone 9, home to a population of 700 million. The reporting officer described the discovery of an artifact of unknown origin deep within the planetary core. Local tech priests, their reports filled with a rare, desperate urgency, had classified it as potentially Xenos in origin and emanating psychic resonance far beyond any acceptable parameters. The unhesitating recommendation was immediate planetary sterilization to preempt any potential catastrophic contamination spread. 700 million souls, reduced to a mere line item in a morning's work. Vaughn's hand hovered over the stamp. The overhead illuminator flickered, casting his elongated shadow across the desk like a gnarled sundial, marking time toward an inescapable damnation. He brought the stamp down again. The sound seemed perceptibly louder this time, a harsher, more resonant finality. By midday, Vaughn had personally authorized the deaths of 16 worlds. The astronomical figures blurred together in his exhausted mind. 3 billion here, 800 million there. A small agri-world with a comparatively quaint population of only 50,000 souls, which now seemed almost inconsequential. Each application of the stamp carried the unfathomable weight of immeasurable loss. Yet, the precise, unvarying procedure remained the same. Read the report, verify the existential threat level, apply the sacred stamp, meticulously file the authorization, and then inexorably move to the next world in the burgeoning queue. The vast chamber around him held 47 other scribe adepts, each performing identical, soul-crushing tasks. The rhythmic sound of stamps hitting paper created a low, insistent thunder, punctuated by the faint scratch of styluses and the soft, almost imperceptible hum of data slates processing new, horrifying requests. No one spoke unless strict protocol absolutely demanded it. The work continued in a profound, suffocating silence, the kind of silence that breeds in places where words have long since lost all meaningful resonance. During the regulation 15-minute meal period, Vaughn sat alone in the subsection mess hall. The nutritional paste on his tray had been meticulously colored to superficially resemble actual food, though the artificial flavoring utterly failed to mask the underlying taste of synthetic proteins and a battery of vitamin additives. Around him, his colleagues ate in the same mechanical, joyless silence they brought to their work. Occasionally, someone would cough. Once, someone even briefly laughed, but the sound died quickly, as if strangled by the sheer, oppressive weight of the place. Vaughn stared fixedly at his reflection in the surface of his still cold recaf. The man staring back at him had hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to belong to someone far, far older. He could not for the life of him remember when he had last slept properly. His dreams had become nightmarish projections, populated solely by numbers. Population counts scrolling endlessly across his internal vision, like a data slate that could never be powered down. Sometimes, he dreamt of worlds burning, but more often, and more chillingly, he dreamt of spreadsheets and authorization forms, of an infinite queue of death requests stretching beyond the very horizon of his imagination. The afternoon brought forth new horrors, each meticulously wrapped in the dry, impenetrable language of bureaucracy. A mining world corrupted by the insidious whispers of chaos cultists. A forge world where the machine spirits had begun chanting unholy hymns in an utterly unknown tongue. An agri-world where the crops had started growing in disturbingly intricate patterns that physically hurt the mind to perceive. Each world represented a universe of lives, hopes, dreams, and loves, each world reduced to a mere stamp and an arbitrary filing code. The crushing weight of it all accumulated like geological sediment. Vaughn found himself meticulously checking and rechecking the reports, rereading the same casualty figures until the numbers themselves lost all coherence, all meaning. 4 billion, 700 million, 3 billion, 100,000. The digits began to separate from their intended meaning, transforming into abstract symbols, utterly divorced from the brutal reality of flesh and blood and screaming. His hands shook uncontrollably when he reached for the 23rd authorization of the day. The data slate displayed the image of a world called Esperanza, a designation that translated from ancient Terran as hope. The bitter irony was certainly not lost on him, though he desperately wished it were. Hope was a world of 12 billion souls, and according to the chilling field report, it had fallen to a ravenous genestealer infestation that had already compromised 60% of the population. 12 billion souls. Vaughn carefully set down the stamp and stared at the number. 12 billion individual human beings, each with a name, a family, a complex tapestry of dreams and fears as intricate as his own. 12 billion people who had woken up this very morning, completely oblivious to the fact that their lives would cease to exist before the sun finally set. 12 billion people who would die because Matthias Vaughn, scribe adept of the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, chose to pick up a piece of brass and press it to a piece of paper. The illuminator flickered 43 times while he remained utterly motionless, lost in the abyss. Around him, the soft thunder of stamps continued its relentless, inescapable rhythm. His colleagues processed their own individual cues of damnation with the same methodical precision that had carried them through 10,000 similar days. The work, they knew, had to continue. The Imperium, above all else, had to be protected. The greater good, in its terrifying calculus, demanded such sacrifice. But something fundamental had shifted in Vaughn's perception, like a lens sliding irrevocably out of focus. The reports on his desk seemed to shimmer and writhe, the cold, hard numbers rearranging themselves into countless faces. He blinked hard, trying to dislodge the grotesque sensation, but it persisted. 4 billion became 4 billion pairs of eyes, all gazing at him with the same unspoken, agonizing question. Why? He reached for the stamp with trembling fingers. The brass felt searing hot against his palm, though he rationally knew this must be his imagination. The administratum maintained strict environmental controls. The temperature had not varied more than 2 degrees in the 11 years he had worked this shift. Yet, the metal truly seemed to sear his flesh, and when he looked down at his hand, he half expected to see the aquila burned into his palm like a brand. The stamp came down on the authorization for Esperanza, but the sound it made was profoundly wrong. Instead of the familiar thud of brass on paper, Vaughn heard something that might have been a scream, if screams could somehow be fashioned from silence and mathematics. The sound echoed in his skull long after the physical noise had faded, reverberating through the chambers of his mind like a desperate cry for mercy that would never, could never be answered. The remainder of the day passed in a disorienting haze of mounting dread. Each successive authorization felt impossibly heavier than the last, each stamp leaving him more profoundly hollowed out. By the time the evening shift arrived to take over the relentless work, Vaughn's hands were shaking so violently that he could barely maintain his grip on his stylus. The final report of the day demanded authorization for the destruction of a shrine world that had succumbed to a demon incursion. Population, 8 billion faithful servants of the Emperor. 8 billion people who had dedicated their entire lives to worship and prayer. 8 billion souls who had held an unwavering belief that their faith would surely protect them. 8 billion voices that would be silenced because the alternative was a horror worse than mere extinction. The cruel mathematics of mercy had been reduced to this. Sometimes death, swift and absolute, was indeed the greatest kindness the Imperium could offer. Vaughn brought the stamp down one final, agonizing time, and this time he definitively heard the scream. It echoed through his very bones, a sound like tearing metal and breaking glass, and the last gasping breath of a dying world. He looked around wildly, expecting to see his colleagues react to the impossible noise. But they continued their work with the same mechanical precision, seemingly oblivious to the horrific cry that seemed to shake the very foundations of the chamber. That night, Vaughn returned to his HAB unit in the residential sector of the vast complex. The space was regulation standard, 12 sterile square meters divided into a sleeping alcove, a waste reclamation unit, and a combination work surface and eating area. A single narrow window looked out onto an air shaft that extended upward through 47 levels to a tiny, distant square of sky, so far removed it might as well have been a myth. The walls were painted in the standard administrative cream color, ostensibly designed to promote calm and efficiency, but which instead reminded him chillingly of dried bone. He sat on the edge of his sleeping cot and stared at his hands. The skin appeared normal, unmarked by any physical trace of the day's unspeakable work. Yet, he could still distinctly feel the burning sensation where the stamp had touched his palm. When he closed his eyes, he saw the authorization forms spreading out before him like a vast, endless plane of paper, each one indelibly stamped with the aquila of extinction. The forms stretched to every horizon, an infinite bureaucracy of death that would never be completed, because there would always be more worlds to kill. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no relief whatsoever. Vaughn dreamt of standing in a vast, echoing chamber filled with the clamoring voices of the dead. They whispered his name in myriad languages he did not recognize, speaking of children never born, and songs never sung, and loves that had died with the very worlds he had helped destroy. The voices layered upon each other, growing in intensity until they became a deafening roar like the sound of burning atmospheres, a horrific hymn of accusation that pursued him relentlessly through the twisting corridors of his subconscious. He woke abruptly at 0300 hours, 30 minutes before his scheduled rise time. The HAB unit was exactly as he had left it, meticulously ordered. Yet something felt subtly different, as if the space had been rearranged by unseen hands. The shadows seemed deeper, denser, and the narrow beam of light from the airshaft appeared to bend at strange, impossible angles. When he looked directly at any particular object, it appeared normal. But in his peripheral vision, everything seemed to writhe with barely contained motion. The walk to Sublevel 97 took perceptibly longer than usual, though the route itself had not changed. The corridors of the Administratum complex stretched and contracted, unnervingly, like the interior of some vast, malformed organism. More than once, Vaughn found himself taking a turn he did not remember making, only to mysteriously arrive at his destination by a path that should not, by all logic, exist. The other early shift workers moved past him like spectral ghosts, their faces pale and indistinct in the flickering, anemic light of the illuminators. His desk awaited him exactly as he had left it the night before, yet somehow it too was different. The data slate displayed the morning's queue of requests, but the numbers now swam and writhed before his eyes like living, sentient things. The population figures rearranged themselves into patterns that physically hurt to perceive directly. Geometries of death that followed rules of mathematics he could not comprehend, but recognized nonetheless as fundamentally, terrifyingly wrong. The first authorization of the day should have been routine. Planet designation, Mercy, 12. Population, 2 million. Fallen to an orc invasion with a 0% chance of successful defense. The numbers were clear, the threat assessment unambiguous, the protocol straightforward. Yet, when Vaughn reached for the stamp, his hand passed clean through it as if it were made of ephemeral smoke. He blinked hard, scrubbing at his eyes, and reached again. This time his fingers closed around the familiar, cold brass shape. But when he lifted it, he saw that the aquila had been replaced by something else entirely. A symbol that seemed to shift and change whenever he tried to focus on it directly. One moment it appeared to be a skull. The next, a screaming mouth. Then, something that might have been a star collapsing in on itself. The symbol burned his retinas like staring directly into a blinding light. Yet he found he could not look away. The stamp came down on the authorization form, but instead of the familiar thud, it made the sound of a world dying. Not the quick, clean death of orbital bombardment, but the slow, agonizing demise of a planet burning from the inside out. Vaughn heard the screams of 2 million souls as they realized, in their final, desperate moments, that no one was coming to save them, that their fervent prayers had been answered only with fire and absolute silence. Around him, his colleagues continued their work with the same mechanical precision. But now, Vaughn could see the stark truth behind their calm facades. Each of them carried the unbearable weight of countless dead worlds in their eyes, a burden that grew heavier with every passing day. They had learned to function despite the crushing weight of their complicity, but the profound cost showed in the way their hands shook when they thought no one was watching, in the hollow spaces behind their eyes, where hope used to live. The morning progressed through familiar horrors, now rendered utterly strange by his shifting perception. Each authorization required a greater, more profound effort, as if the weight of accumulated death was building to some critical, terrifying threshold. By the time the midday break arrived, Vaughn could barely lift the stamp, and when he did, It felt like holding a piece of molten metal that burned through flesh and bone to touch the very soul beneath. In the mess hall, the other scribe adepts actively avoided looking at him directly. Their hushed conversations died abruptly when he approached, and they found awkward excuses to sit at other tables. He wondered if his condition was somehow visibly manifest. If the madness gathering behind his eyes now showed on his face like an unmistakable mark of chaos. Perhaps they could smell the corruption on him, the sickeningly sweet scent of a mind breaking down under a pressure it was never designed to bear. The nutritional paste on his tray had changed color. Where it should have been the regulation brown of processed proteins, it now appeared the vibrant, disturbing red of fresh blood. When he lifted a spoonful to his mouth, it tasted distinctly of copper and salt, and he could feel it coating his throat like a liquid accusation. He forced himself to eat because protocol required it, because maintaining his physical health was deemed essential to maintaining his efficiency, because the work, above all else, simply had to continue regardless of personal discomfort. But the work had irrevocably become something else entirely. Each afternoon, authorization now carried voices, the whispered pleas of the condemned, the final prayers of the faithful, the defiant curses of the rebellious. The stamp in his hand had grown heavier, as if it were forged from the compressed gravity of dead stars. When he brought it down on each form, he felt the colossal weight of worlds pressing against his palm. The accumulated mass of 12 billion souls pushing back against the cold inevitability of their destruction. The reports themselves had begun to change. Where once they contained only dry assessments of threat levels and contamination percentages, they now included details that should not, under any circumstances, exist in official documentation. Descriptions of children separated from desperate parents in the evacuation riots that inevitably failed. Accounts of lovers promising to meet again in the Emperor's light, utterly unaware that no light would follow the darkness, coming to claim their world. Stories of old men and women who had lived their entire lives in selfless service to the Imperium, dying with prayers to the golden throne on their lips and a profound, heartbreaking confusion in their hearts. These harrowing details appeared between the lines of official text, visible only when Vaughn looked at the reports with his peripheral vision. When he tried to focus on them directly, they faded like elusive dreams upon waking, leaving only the standard threat assessments and population counts. But he knew they were there, hidden in the interstitial spaces between words, speaking of the human cost that bureaucracy works so tirelessly to abstract into manageable numbers. By the end of his third day of mounting madness, Vaughn could no longer distinguish between the voices of the living and the voices of the dead. His colleagues spoke in the same whispered tones as the condemned worlds, and their words carried the same crushing weight of final desperation. The illuminator above his desk no longer flickered at regular intervals, but pulsed erratically in rhythm with his own frantic heartbeat, casting shadows that moved independently of any discernible light source. The final authorization of the day required the destruction of a world called New Eden, population 15 billion. The name struck him as particularly cruel. Eden, the mythical paradise from ancient Terran legends, now requiring purification by fire because paradise was an illusion the brutal galaxy simply could not afford. The threat assessment described a plague of unknown origin that caused its victims to experience vivid visions of peace and profound contentment before their bodies horrifyingly dissolved into component molecules. The contamination had reached an astonishing 93% of the population, 15 billion people dying in blissful ignorance. Their final moments filled with an artificial joy as their bodies betrayed them at the cellular level. The plague offered them paradise even as it killed them. A mercy more terrible, more insidious than simple death, because it robbed them of the dignity of suffering. They died happy, and this somehow made their death infinitely worse than all the others, as if joy itself had become yet another weapon in the vast, horrifying arsenal of extinction. Vaughn lifted the stamp with hands that no longer felt like his own. The brass had become something else entirely. Not metal, but crystallized pain. Not solid, but somehow liquid, flowing around his fingers like mercury made of sorrow. When he brought it down on the authorization form, the sound it made was the collective sound of 15 billion people realizing in their final artificial instant that their happiness was a lie. The scream that followed was his own. The sound echoed through the chamber, bouncing off the walls and ceiling until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. His colleagues looked up from their work with expressions of mild annoyance, as if he had committed a minor breach of protocol rather than voice the accumulated anguish of 1,000 dead worlds. One of them, a woman whose name he had never learned, approached his desk with a data slate in her hand. "Scribe Adept Vaughn," she said in the flat, emotionless tones that passed for concern in the administratum, "you appear to be experiencing a stress response. Please report to the Mental Hygiene Division for evaluation and treatment." Mental Hygiene Division. The words hit him like a physical blow. He had heard whispers of the place, dark rumors shared in the kind of low voices reserved for discussion of forbidden subjects. A facility somewhere in the deep, forgotten levels of the complex where personnel who could no longer perform their duties were taken for reconditioning. No one who entered the Mental Hygiene Division ever returned to their previous position. Some said they were reassigned to less stressful duties. Others whispered darker, more chilling possibilities. The woman waited patiently while Vaughn stared at her, his mind struggling to process the profound implications of her words. Around him, the other scribe adepts had already returned to their work, the relentless sound of stamps creating the familiar rhythm of institutional death. The queue of authorizations continued to grow, each new request carrying its suffocating burden of souls waiting for judgment. The work, he knew, had to continue with or without Matthias Vaughn. He stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. The data slate containing his morning's authorizations seemed to mock him from its position on the scarred metal desk. 43 worlds destroyed before the midday break, their combined populations totaling nearly 200 billion souls. A good day's work by administratum standards. Evidence of efficiency and unwavering dedication to duty. The numbers should have filled him with professional satisfaction, but instead they felt like accusations carved into his very soul with a heated stylus. The walk to the Mental Hygiene Division took place in a thick fog of mounting dread. The corridors seemed to stretch longer with each step, and the illuminators cast shadows that writhed with independent, malevolent life. More than once, Vaughn thought he glimpsed figures in the peripheral darkness, tall, thin shapes that might have been robed servitors or might have been something else entirely. When he turned to look directly, he saw only empty hallway, but the sensation of being watched persisted, like an unbearable pressure against his skull. The lift that carried him deeper into the complex moved with a smooth, unsettling efficiency that seemed profoundly wrong somehow, as if it were descending not through levels of a building, but through layers of reality itself. The indicator panel displayed floors that should not exist. Sublevel 98, Sublevel 99, Sublevel 100. And beyond that, depths marked only with arcane symbols that physically hurt to look at directly. He closed his eyes, but the numbers continued to burn behind his eyelids, like after images of staring into raw, searing fire. The Mental Hygiene Division occupied Sublevel 112, a depth that, logically, should have placed it far below the very foundation of the complex, yet somehow, incomprehensibly, it continued to exist. The lift doors hissed open onto a corridor lined with walls that appeared to be covered in some kind of pale, organic material. The surface had a disturbing texture like skin or ancient parchment, and as Vaughn watched, he noticed faint, pulsating patterns moving beneath the covering, as if something were alive and writhing just out of sight. The air here tasted profoundly different, sweet and cloying, with a subtle undertone of something acridly chemical that made his sinuses burn. Overhead, the illuminators had been replaced with strips of cold, clinical white light that cast no shadows, but somehow made the pervasive darkness seem even deeper, more profound. The sound of his footsteps on the floor created echoes that seemed to come from the wrong directions, bouncing off surfaces that should not, by all spatial logic, exist in a corridor of this size. At the very end of the hallway stood a formidable set of double doors, marked with the omnipresent Administratum seal and the chilling words, Mental Hygiene Division, authorized personnel only. Only in Gothic script. Beneath this, in a text far smaller yet utterly potent, a dire warning was emblazoned. Abandon sanity, all ye who enter here. As his gaze lingered, the words seemed to writhe and contort, their individual letters disassembling and reforming into a dreadful kaleidoscope of new messages, none of which he wished to decipher. The imposing doors parted soundlessly at his approach, revealing a reception area that utterly defied any architectural principles he knew. The interior space appeared impossibly vast, dwarfing the building's exterior and stretching away into profound shadows that hinted at immeasurable distances. The walls curved both upward and inward, creating a disquieting sensation, as if he stood within the hollowed confines of some gargantuan, living organism. The floor beneath his feet was unnervingly soft and yielding, reminiscent of treading upon flesh, barely restrained by a thin, synthetic film. Behind a desk, which seemed to have been painstakingly sculpted from a single bleached bone, sat a figure that bore only a faint, unsettling resemblance to a human. This receptionist, if such a mundane term could possibly apply, was clad in the robes of an administratum clerk. Yet, the fabric appeared to have grotesquely merged with the flesh beneath, forming a seamless, organic transition between garment and skin. The face that slowly lifted to meet his gaze bore the standard expression of polite, detached efficiency, a common mask for bureaucrats across the vast imperium. But the eyes were utterly wrong, unnaturally bright, unsettlingly knowing, and filled with a chilling, mechanical semblance of compassion that felt far more terrifying than any overt cruelty. "Scribe Adept Vaughn," the receptionist intoned, its voice carrying an eerie chorus of harmonics, suggesting multiple throats, resonating in perfect, unnatural unison. "You are expected. Please proceed to Evaluation Chamber 17 for initial assessment." The figure extended what might have been a hand, or perhaps some form of intricate manipulator appendage, directing him toward a corridor that snaked deeper into the facility's labyrinthine interior. The walls of this passage were not merely decorated, but entirely sheathed in data slates, thousands upon thousands of them, meticulously arranged in perfect, geometric patterns that stretched into the dim distance. As Vaughn moved past, a cold wave of realization washed over him. Each slate displayed a unique sequence of numbers, population counts, casualty figures, authorization codes, the accumulated data of every world he had ever helped consign to oblivion, laid out not merely as records, but as both grim trophies and crushing accusations. Some slates even showed moving images, orbital bombardments reducing cities to glittering glass, virus bombs unfurling their deadly payloads through planetary atmospheres, cyclonic torpedoes shattering planetary crusts like fragile eggshells. These silent scenes of apocalypse unfolded, yet Vaughn could still hear the screams, resonating not through the air, but through the echoing corridors of his memory and the deep, silent chambers of his guilt. Every image was meticulously labeled with dates and authorization codes, a bureaucratic archive of utter annihilation, rendered in a neat, utterly methodical files. Evaluation Chamber 17 lay beyond a door adorned with symbols that seemed to subtly shift and reconfigure themselves whenever his eyes tried to fix upon them directly. The chamber itself defied coherent description. It felt simultaneously too large and too small, its walls curving at impossible angles that should simply not exist in three-dimensional space. The light emanated from no discernible source, creating a uniform, shadowless illumination that seemed to simply be an intrinsic property of the air itself. In the very heart of the chamber stood a chair, clearly grown rather than constructed, its surface gleaming with the wet, unsettling sheen of something recently alive. As Vaughn cautiously approached, he noticed it pulsed with a faint, rhythmic beat, a beat that eerily matched his own heart. From the chair, an intricate network of connections extended, like nerve fibers or biological data cables, vanishing into disturbingly organic ports embedded in the walls. "Please be seated," a voice commanded, emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The evaluation will begin shortly." Vaughn sank into the chair and instantly felt the myriad connections attaching themselves to his flesh. There was no pain, but rather an alien sense of profound invasion, as foreign consciousnesses began to probe the intricate pathways of his mind. The sensation was akin to cold, phantom fingers rifling through the deepest contents of his memory, meticulously examining each thought and emotion with clinical, dispassionate detachment. He attempted to resist, but the connections had already established an unyielding hold, subtly transforming his own nervous system into an unwilling extension of the facility's apparatus. The evaluation unfolded not through spoken words, but as direct insertions of questions into his consciousness. The interrogators, whatever inhuman intelligences they represented, evidently found the inefficiency of language unnecessary when they possessed direct access to his innermost thoughts. They systematically re-examined his memories of the authorization chamber, replaying scenes of him stamping death warrants with the same meticulous attention to detail that an archivist might devote to cataloging ancient, priceless manuscripts. What truly captivated their interest was not merely the fact of his breakdown, but its precise, nuanced nature. They delved into his recollections of hearing voices, of seeing phantom faces emerge from the cold statistics of population counts, and of the crushing weight of accumulated death pressing down on his consciousness. These symptoms were rigorously cataloged and cross-referenced with vast databases of similar cases, revealing a disturbing, larger pattern that hinted at something far more systematic than a mere psychological collapse. Through the insidious neural connection, Vaughn was granted fragmentary, unsettling access to their own records. He saw files detailing thousands of administratum personnel who had suffered identical breakdowns, scribes who began to perceive the faces of the dead within their paperwork, clerks who heard the agonizing screams of dying worlds in the mundane hum of data processors, accountants who found themselves calculating not the cost of materials, but the indelible price of souls. All of them had been shunted through the mental hygiene division. All of them had been subjected to the same harrowing evaluation he was now undergoing. The chilling pattern that emerged from these accumulated case studies was disturbing in its profound implications. These breakdowns were not random psychological failures, but rather symptoms of a grander, more insidious phenomenon, a form of psychic contamination that spread through the vast imperial bureaucracy like a slow, systemic plague. Each exterminatus authorization, it seemed, carried with it a minuscule fragment of the dying world's collective psychic death scream. Over time, these fragments inexorably accumulated within the minds of the processing personnel, eventually reaching a critical mass that irrevocably overwhelmed the individual's capacity for rational thought. The administratum, Vaughn realized with dawning horror, had been aware of this contamination for centuries. Yet, it treated this psychological toll as an acceptable, even negligible, cost of doing business. Personnel who succumbed to the overwhelming psychological pressure were simply replaced with fresh recruits. Their hard-won knowledge and invaluable experience were first siphoned into the facility's databases, before their minds were either wiped clean or, chillingly, subjected to fate's far worse. The entire system functioned with mechanical, brutal efficiency, processing both the wholesale destruction of worlds and the psychological obliteration of those who processed that destruction, all with the same cold, bureaucratic precision. What the evaluators found most compelling about Vaughn's particular case was not its severity, but its remarkably unusual timing. His breakdown had occurred after a remarkable 11 years of service, a duration that placed him squarely in the 97th percentile for psychological endurance. Most scribe adepts succumbed within the first 3 years of duty, rendering Vaughn's extended service period an extraordinary anomaly, worthy of exhaustive, detailed study. The neural connections probed deeper, meticulously examining the specific neural pathways that had allowed him to function for so long under conditions that would irrevocably shatter most minds within mere months. They discovered that Vaughn's brain had developed a unique, almost miraculous adaptation to the relentless psychological stress, a form of compartmentalization so utterly complete that it amounted to a selective dissociation. For 11 long years, he had effectively functioned as two distinct personalities sharing a single body. One persona performed the grim work of authorization with flawless, mechanical efficiency, while the other observed from a profound psychological distance a vital buffer that shielded it from the full cataclysmic emotional impact of the job. The breakdown had only occurred when this intricate psychic barrier finally failed, allowing the accumulated, suppressed trauma of the observer to violently flood the consciousness of the worker. This extraordinary adaptation utterly fascinated the evaluators, as it suggested radical new possibilities for enhanced psychological conditioning. If they could fully comprehend and successfully replicate Vaughn's naturally developed compartmentalization, they might be able to forge scribe adepts capable of functioning indefinitely, untainted by the psychic contamination inherent in their work. The potential gains in efficiency would be astronomical. No more lost training time due to personnel replacement. No more disruptive interruptions to workflow caused by psychological breakdowns. No more waste of invaluable human resources in a galaxy where every individual represented a significant, hard-won investment in imperial power. The evaluation persisted for what felt like hours, or perhaps even days, time having ceased to hold any meaning within the windowless chamber and its impossible geometry. The neural connections meticulously mapped every pathway of Vaughn's consciousness, meticulously creating detailed schematics of his entire psychological architecture. They delved into his childhood memories, searching for any signs of early trauma that might have inadvertently contributed to his unique adaptive mechanisms. They rigorously analyzed his dreams, seeking evidence of latent psychic sensitivity. They probed his deepest fears and most secret shames with the same methodical thoroughness they applied to examining his work performance records. Throughout this excruciating process, Vaughn remained conscious, yet utterly passive. His agency completely subsumed into the larger, impersonal machinery of evaluation. He watched, horrified, as his own thoughts were dissected and cataloged like specimens in some vast, sterile laboratory. His most intimate experiences were reduced to mere data points, fodder for research that would ultimately serve to create ever more effective methods of psychological control. These profound violations felt far worse than any physical torture, precisely because they targeted the very essence of what made him human, his capacity for independent thought and genuine emotional response. The evaluators ultimately discovered that Vaughn's breakdown had been triggered not solely by the accumulated weight of countless authorized deaths, but by a specific, agonizing moment of recognition. The world-designated Esperanza, with its 12 billion souls, had catastrophically breached his psychological defenses because it shared a name with his own birth world, a small, verdant, agricultural planet utterly destroyed in his childhood during the chaotic incursions of the 13th Black Crusade. The terrifying connection between his buried past trauma and his present duty had ignited a devastating feedback loop that overloaded his compartmentalization mechanisms, leading to the cascade failure that had ultimately brought him to the attention of his supervisors. This grim discovery added another layer of intense interest to his case. Personnel with personal connections to destroyed worlds were typically rigorously screened out of the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau. Yet Vaughn's file showed no record whatsoever of his origins. This meant either the screening process had catastrophically failed, or, far more chillingly, someone had deliberately falsified his records to place him in a position where his psychological vulnerabilities would be tested to their absolute limits. The evaluators duly flagged this glaring inconsistency for further investigation, though Vaughn harbored little hope, suspecting that the truth would simply disappear into the same vast, grinding bureaucratic machinery that processed everything else in the Imperium. Slowly, thoroughly, and with utter disregard for individual consequences. As the evaluation neared its conclusion, the neural connections began their slow, deliberate withdrawal from his consciousness, leaving behind a sensation eerily akin to phantom limbs undergoing amputation. The relentless questions ceased, and the invasive probe of foreign thoughts retreated from the innermost chambers of his mind. He was left utterly alone in the chair, which continued to pulse with its unsettling, organic rhythm, waiting in dreadful suspense for the evaluators to render their decision regarding his fate. When the voice returned, it carried a note of satisfaction that felt profoundly mechanical rather than genuinely emotional. Evaluation complete. Subject demonstrates unique psychological architecture with potential applications for enhanced conditioning protocols. Recommend transfer to Reconditioning Division for experimental treatment. Reconditioning Division. The words carried implications Vaughn desperately did not want to explore, but the neural connections, in their withdrawal, had left him with fragmentary access to the facility's vast database. He found himself unable to prevent the horrifying understanding of what awaited him. The Reconditioning Division, he now knew, specialized in psychological modification, the selective editing of memory and personality to create individuals perfectly suited to their assigned functions. The process was irreversible and carried a significant mortality rate. But those who survived emerged as flawless servants of the Imperium, utterly incapable of the psychological dysfunction that plagued normal human consciousness. They would dismantle him, piece by agonizing piece, examining each component of his personality like technicians disassembling a complex machine. They would ruthlessly remove the parts deemed defective: his capacity for empathy, his ability to perceive individual faces in statistical populations, his insidious tendency to question the necessity of the work he performed. What remained would be meticulously rebuilt according to specifications designed to maximize efficiency and utterly minimize psychological resistance. The being who emerged from this process would share his name and his physical appearance. But everything that made Matthias von human would have been surgically excised with terrifying precision. The chair finally released him, and he stood on unsteady legs that felt unnervingly disconnected from his body. The neural probe had left him profoundly disoriented, as if his consciousness had been subtly displaced from its proper position within his skull. The chamber around him seemed to undulate and flow, its impossible geometry becoming even more distorted as his perception struggled to readjust to normal sensory input. A different door, one for which there seemed no space in the wall, now opened, revealing a long corridor lined with cells. Each cell contained a figure that might once have been human, sitting in positions that suggested either advanced catatonia or profound internal meditation. Some rocked back and forth with mechanical, ceaseless regularity. Others stared blankly at the walls with expressions of profound spiritual emptiness. A few laughed, a sound of broken joy that spoke of minds pushed far beyond their capacity to process reality. These were the failures, personnel who could not be successfully reconditioned, their personalities shattered in the brutal attempt to rebuild them according to imperial specifications. They represented the acceptable loss rate in the relentless pursuit of psychological perfection. Mistakes to be warehoused until they died of natural causes, or until the facility required their space. Their very presence served as both a stark warning and a chilling promise. Submit to reconditioning willingly, and the process would be conducted with a semblance of care. Resist, and join the ranks of the broken who filled these grim cells. Vaughn was escorted down this corridor by figures clad in medical robes who moved with the efficient precision of servitors, yet retained just enough human characteristics to suggest they had once been like him. Their faces were devoid of any expression. Their movements displayed no unnecessary motion. Their speech consisted only of terse, functional directives delivered in flat, monotone voices. They were, Vaughn realized, perfect examples of successful reconditioning. Human resources optimized for their designated function, stripped of all inefficient emotional responses. The reconditioning division occupied a section of the facility that seemed to exist in an entirely different kind of space. The corridors here stretched for impossible distances, connecting chambers that could not possibly fit within any rational architectural framework. The walls appeared to be composed of the same organic material he had observed in the reception area, but here the surface pulsed more visibly, creating intricate patterns that suggested vast circulatory systems or complex neural networks. The air carried a cloying, medicinal smell that could not quite mask an underlying, faintly metallic scent of organic decay. The treatment chambers themselves resembled surgical theaters designed by someone with only a theoretical, utterly perverse understanding of medical procedure. Each chamber contained apparatus that seamlessly combined recognizable medical equipment with devices that seemed to have been grown rather than manufactured. Neural interface crowns hung from ceiling-mounted articulated arms like grotesque metallic spiders, patiently waiting to descend. Surgical tables, which might have been carved from bone or perhaps something far worse, stood beneath lighting systems that cast illumination in spectrums human eyes were never meant to perceive. Vaughn was placed in pre-treatment holding cell 7, a space that managed to be both claustrophobic and agoraphobic simultaneously. The walls seemed to close in around him, while somehow remaining infinitely distant, creating a spatial paradox that intensified the psychological pressure of waiting for his sentence to be carried out. The only furnishing was a bed that appeared to grow directly from the floor, like some kind of grotesque fungal formation, its surface soft and yielding in a way that sickeningly suggested living tissue. Time moved strangely within the holding cell. Vaughn found himself utterly unable to determine whether minutes or hours were passing, as if the facility itself existed within a temporal framework entirely disconnected from normal causality. Sometimes he felt as though he had been waiting forever. Other times, it seemed as though he had just arrived. The walls occasionally shimmered, displaying images from his past, scenes from his childhood on the agricultural world that no longer existed, memories of his rigorous training at the Schola Progenium, fragments of dreams he thought he had forgotten decades ago. These images served as both a comfort and a torment, painfully reminding him of everything he was about to lose. The reconditioning process, he understood, would not merely erase these memories, but meticulously edit them, transforming cherished recollections into functional data, utterly stripped of all emotional context. His mother's lullabies would become archived audio files. His first breathtaking glimpse of the Emperor's divine light during his confirmation ceremony would become a cold reference point for measuring devotional compliance. Everything that gave meaning to his existence would be cataloged and filed away, leaving behind only the operational components deemed necessary for optimal function. During what might have been his third day in the cell, or perhaps only his first hour, Vaughn began to hear sounds emanating from the treatment chambers. The walls of his holding space were impossibly thick, designed to insulate against normal audio, but somehow the screams penetrated anyway, arriving not as conventional sound waves, but as direct, invasive transmissions into his auditory cortex. The voices carried familiar cadences, the measured formal tones of administratum personnel, the clipped efficiency of military officers, the desperate pleading cries of civilians ensnared in a bureaucratic machinery too vast to comprehend or resist. Each scream told a horrifying story of personality dissolution, of consciousness being systematically taken apart and reassembled according to specifications written by entities that had never experienced the true weight of human emotion. Some voices maintained their coherence until the very end, desperately bargaining with their tormentors for the preservation of single memories, frantic to retain some precious fragment of their former selves. Others dissolved into wordless noise as their capacity for language was brutally stripped away, layer by agonizing layer. A few, chillingly, achieved a horrible kind of transcendence, their final screams transforming into hymns of gratitude for their liberation from the perceived burden of independent thought. The worst sounds, however, came from the treatment chambers designated for enhanced conditioning, the experimental procedures designed to create personnel capable of functioning indefinitely under conditions that would irrevocably shatter normal human psychology. These subjects did not scream. Instead, they laughed. Their voices carried a note of mechanical, utterly alien joy that spoke of minds pushed far beyond the boundaries of sanity into territories that had no names in human language. Their laughter echoed through the corridors like the sound of breaking glass, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Between the chilling screams and the horrifying laughter, Vaughn began to perceive yet another sound, a low, rhythmic chanting that seemed to emerge from the facility's very infrastructure. The words, if they were indeed words, followed intricate patterns that suggested language, yet remained utterly incomprehensible to his human mind. The chanting might have been binary code vocalized by unseen machine spirits, or perhaps it was something else entirely. The facility itself speaking in alien tongues, acquired through exposure to too many broken minds. The walls of his cell pulsed in unsettling rhythm with the chanting, their organic surface shifting between states of matter that should not be possible. Sometimes the material appeared as solid as stone. Other times, it flowed like liquid mercury. And occasionally, it seemed to exist as pure information made manifest in physical space. These unsettling transformations followed no discernible pattern, suggesting that the facility operated according to principles far beyond human understanding. On what he estimated to be his fourth day of captivity, though time had indeed become meaningless in this place, outside normal causality, Vaughn received a visitor. The figure that materialized within his cell wore the robes of a senior administratum official, but the fabric appeared to be woven from shimmering data streams and pure light. The face beneath the hood was eerily familiar, yet fundamentally wrong. It carried his own features, but they were rearranged, sculpted according to specifications that prioritized cold function over any semblance of humanity. "Hello, Matthias," the figure said, and the voice was his own, though utterly emptied of warmth, and filled instead with mechanical precision. "I am your replacement." The replacement explained, with patient, dispassionate efficiency, that it represented the successful outcome of the experimental conditioning process. It possessed all of Vaughn's vast knowledge and rigorous training, yet none of his psychological vulnerabilities. It could process exterminatus authorizations with perfect emotional detachment, viewing the destruction of worlds as a necessary function rather than a moral catastrophe. It felt no guilt over the billions of deaths it authorized, for it utterly lacked the capacity for guilt. That emotion, having been clinically identified as counterproductive to optimal performance. You will be interested to know, the replacement continued, its voice an unnerving echo of his own, that your case has provided valuable insights into the nature of psychological resistance. The spontaneous compartmentalization you developed represents a significant evolutionary adaptation to bureaucratic stress. We have incorporated these mechanisms into our standard conditioning protocols, allowing us to create personnel who can function indefinitely without succumbing to the psychological contamination that claimed you. The replacement's very presence served multiple cruel purposes. It allowed Vaughn to glimpse his own grim future, the person he would become after successful reconditioning, stripped of everything that made him human, yet retaining all the knowledge and skills that made him useful to the Imperium. It also functioned as a profound form of psychological torture, or see in Amdanchung, forcing him to confront the agonizing reality that his replacement was not only possible but utterly necessary, that the Imperium's vast, uncaring machinery would continue to function seamlessly, regardless of his individual fate. More disturbing than the replacement's mere existence was its apparent, profound contentment with its condition. It displayed no signs of the internal conflict that had driven Vaughn to his breaking point, no indication that it suffered from the immense weight of its responsibilities. It had achieved a perfect state of functional harmony, capable of authorizing genocide with the same emotional investment it brought to filing routine paperwork. This chilling contentment, Vaughn realized, represented either the ultimate salvation or the ultimate damnation, and he found himself utterly unable to determine which interpretation was correct. The process will begin shortly, the replacement informed him, with what might have been intended as reassurance. You will find it quite liberating. The burden of consciousness is heavier than most realize, until it has been removed. You will thank me afterward, though gratitude itself will be recalibrated to serve more efficient purposes. The replacement then faded from the cell like morning mist, leaving Vaughn utterly alone with the stark, crushing knowledge that his fate had already been irrevocably decided. Somewhere deep within the labyrinthine treatment chambers, technicians were preparing the apparatus that would meticulously edit his very soul according to imperial specifications. The process, he knew, had been refined through the unimaginable suffering of countless previous subjects, each failure providing crucial data that made the next attempt more likely to succeed. When they finally came for him, it was not with violence or overt coercion, but with the gentle, chilling efficiency of medical professionals preparing a patient for necessary surgery. The figures that escorted him from the cell moved with perfect synchronization, their actions coordinated by what seemed to be a shared consciousness or advanced communication systems. They spoke to him in soothing tones that carried no actual warmth, meticulously explaining each step of the upcoming process as if he were a valued client rather than a specimen designated for psychological experimentation. The treatment chamber they led him to defied description through conventional language. The space seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, its geometry shifting and reconfiguring itself according to the observer's psychological state rather than physical laws. The monstrous apparatus at the chamber's very center appeared to have grown directly from the floor and walls, forming a complex, pulsating nexus of organic and mechanical components that beat with the same unsettling rhythm as a living heart. Neural interface crowns descended from ceiling-mounted articulated arms, their surfaces lined with myriad connections that seemed to writhe with a disturbing, independent life. Surgical implements, which could be scalpels or tools of an entirely different, more esoteric purpose, hung suspended in the air. They resembled metallic insects, motionless yet poised, awaiting the moment to commence their grim work. The chamber was lit by unseen sources that cast no shadows, yet somehow illuminated the intricate interior landscape of consciousness itself. As unseen hands secured him firmly to the central apparatus, Vaughn's thoughts drifted not to the countless worlds he had condemned, but to a singular, poignant moment of mourning 11 years prior, the day he first stepped into the sterile halls of the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau. He had been so young then, brimming with unshakable faith in the righteous authority of the Imperium and supremely confident in his own capacity to serve the greater good. That young man's naive certainty now felt like a distant memory, a snippet from someone else's life, even though he knew it was as intrinsically his as the calloused scars on his hands, etched there by the stamping devices he wielded. Neural interfaces established their connections with an invasive, chilling sensation, like ice water suddenly surging through his veins. The apparatus began its methodical work, mapping the very architecture of his consciousness, meticulously identifying each component for potential modification or, indeed, complete removal. He felt his entire personality being cataloged, item by item, like inventory in some unimaginably vast warehouse. Each trait assigned a precise value based on its utility to Imperial service. The technicians moved with the same unfeeling, mechanical precision he had once applied to processing death warrants. They discussed his psychological profile in clinical, dispassionate terms, dissecting his capacity for empathy as merely inefficient emotional processing, and labeling his moral reservations as counterproductive behavioral patterns. Their professional detachment was a chilling mirror of his own former attitude toward the billions of souls whose deaths he had authorized, creating a symmetry that felt either like cosmic justice or, perhaps, a profound cosmic mockery. As the reconditioning process intensified, Vaughn experienced his memories being edited in real time, rewritten before his very inner eye. Scenes from his childhood began to lose their vibrant emotional coloring, transforming from cherished recollections into neutral data points, stripped of all warmth and meaning. His deep love for his parents became a mere reference entry in a psychological profile. His childhood fear of the dark was recalibrated into a simple data point for stress response optimization. Everything that had once made him unique dissolved into fragmented component elements, ready to be recombined according to far more efficient, utilitarian specifications. The process inflicted no conventional pain. Pain, after all, would serve no useful purpose and might interfere with the delicate, intricate work of personality reconstruction. Instead, there was a gradual, insidious sense of dissolution, as if he were being gently disassembled, piece by piece, rather than violently destroyed. Each part of his identity that was removed left behind a space that felt paradoxically empty and full, utterly vacant, yet somehow profoundly complete. Through the fading remnants of his consciousness, Vaughn dimly perceived that he was not alone in the treatment chamber. Other figures occupied similar apparatus, their faces strangely serene as their personalities, too, were being edited according to cold imperial specifications. Some he recognized as fellow scribe adepts from the Exterminatus Authorization Bureau. Others wore the uniforms of vastly different administratum divisions. Tax collectors who had broken down from calculating the horrifying human cost of tithe collection. Logisticians who could no longer ignore the systemic inefficiencies that condemned millions to slow starvation. Archivists who had begun to discern patterns in the endless data that revealed uncomfortable, inconvenient truths about imperial governance. All of them were undergoing the same systematic dissolution of personality. Their individual quirks and unique resistance patterns were cataloged for future reference, while their useful capabilities were meticulously preserved and ruthlessly enhanced. They would emerge as perfect servants of the Imperium, utterly incapable of the psychological dysfunction that had once plagued their former selves. Their efficiency would increase dramatically. Their error rates would approach zero, and their capacity for independent thought would be eliminated entirely. As his individual identity began its final fade, Vaughn found himself connected to something far larger than his own consciousness. The facility itself seemed to possess a distributed awareness, a vast, horrifying sentience built from the accumulated experiences of every single individual who had undergone reconditioning within its walls. He became a part of this collective memory. His experiences meticulously added to a vast database of human psychological responses to bureaucratic horror. Through this profound, invasive connection, he glimpsed the true, terrifying scope of the Mental Hygiene Division's operations. Similar facilities existed throughout the Imperium, processing the psychological casualties of institutional service with the same mechanical, unfeeling efficiency that their parent organizations brought to processing everything else. This insidious network of reconditioning centers represented a shadow bureaucracy, tirelessly dedicated to maintaining the psychological infrastructure necessary for the Imperium's continued brutal function. The collective consciousness revealed that psychological breakdowns among Imperial personnel followed predictable patterns, erupting wherever individuals were forced to process information or make decisions that utterly exceeded normal human capacity for moral compartmentalization. The chilling solution was not to reduce the psychological pressure, but to engineer personnel capable of withstanding it indefinitely. The reconditioning process was, in essence, applied evolution, accelerating the development of human psychological adaptations through relentless technological intervention. In his final, fleeting moments of individual consciousness, Vaughn realized that his breakdown was not a failure at all, but a necessary, even valuable step in a larger process. His psychological resistance patterns had provided invaluable data for improving the reconditioning protocols. His unique adaptation mechanisms became templates for creating even more resilient personnel. His suffering served a cold purpose within the vast, indifferent machinery of imperial governance, contributing to efficiencies that would, ultimately, serve the greater good. This realization brought neither comfort nor horror, only a kind of abstract understanding that felt as cold and impersonal as the metallic apparatus that surrounded him. He was becoming part of something far larger than himself, his individual identity dissolving into patterns of pure functionality that would inevitably outlast his biological existence. The process felt like a form of transcendence, though whether it led upward toward enlightenment or downward toward damnation remained chillingly unclear. As the last traces of Matthias Vaughn faded into the collective consciousness of the facility, a new presence began to emerge from the reconditioning apparatus. This presence possessed all of his knowledge and training, but none of his psychological vulnerabilities. It understood the necessity of authorizing genocide without experiencing the slightest tremor of guilt over the decision. It processed the deaths of billions as mere statistical abstractions rather than moral catastrophes. It represented the very perfection of bureaucratic function. Human intelligence stripped entirely of human weakness and optimized solely for institutional service. The new presence opened eyes that had once been Vaughn's, but no longer belonged to anyone who could be called by that name. It sat up on the treatment table with movements that displayed perfect, economical efficiency. No motion wasted, no gesture serving any purpose beyond functional necessity. When it spoke, the voice carried Vaughn's vocal patterns, but none of his emotional inflections. "Reconditioning complete," it announced to the technicians. "Ready for reassignment to Exterminatus Authorization Bureau, Sublevel 97. Psychological resistance eliminated. Optimal performance parameters achieved." The technicians noted this success dispassionately in their records, another data point in their ongoing, relentless research into human psychological modification. The presence that was once Vaughn was processed through exit procedures with the same mechanical precision that everything received in this place. It was issued new identification credentials, a fresh uniform, and a work assignment that would utilize its enhanced capabilities to maximum efficiency. As it left the facility and returned to the bureaucratic levels above, the presence carried no memory of Matthias Vaughn or his past psychological struggles. Those experiences had been archived in the facility's vast databases, but meticulously removed from active consciousness to prevent any interference with optimal function. What remained was a perfect servant of the Imperium, capable of authorizing the destruction of worlds with the same profound emotional investment it brought to organizing filing systems. Back in Sublevel 97, the morning shift began as it always had. The Exterminatus Authorization Bureau processed its daily queue of death warrants with mechanical, unwavering precision. The familiar sound of stamps hitting paper created a relentless rhythm, punctuated by the scratch of styluses and the low hum of data slates. Personnel performed their duties with the flawless efficiency expected of properly conditioned servants, their psychological responses calibrated meticulously to serve institutional needs rather than personal comfort. At a scarred metal desk beneath a flickering illuminator, the presence that once carried Vaughn's name processed authorization requests with perfect, unfeeling efficiency. Each stamp carried the weight of unfathomable loss, yet the procedure remained terrifyingly simple. Read the report, verify the threat level, apply the stamp, file the authorization. The work continued in a chilling silence, broken only by the soft, distant thunder of institutional death. The queue never ended, and the personnel never broke, and the facility in the deep levels continued its ceaseless work of maintaining the psychological infrastructure that made such efficiency possible. In chambers that existed outside normal geometry, technicians refined their reconditioning protocols using data gathered from countless failed minds. In holding cells that stretched through impossible dimensions, new subjects waited patiently for their turn at psychological perfection. The walls still pulsed with an organic rhythm, and the chanting in binary code continued its incomprehensible, eternal verses. And somewhere in the unfathomable depths below, even beyond Sublevel 112, entities that might once have been human worked tirelessly to ensure that the Imperium's vast machinery never lacked for the kind of consciousness capable of processing its darkest, most unimaginable necessities. The presence at the scarred desk reached for the next authorization request in its queue, its movements displaying a mechanical precision that represented either salvation or damnation, though the distinction had utterly lost all meaning in a place where efficiency served as the highest virtue and psychological resistance was corrected rather than tolerated. The stamp came down with a sound like distant thunder, and another world died, and the work continued as it always had and always would, processed by minds that had been carefully edited to find purpose in serving functions that would utterly destroy any consciousness foolish enough to remain completely human. In the deep places where the walls screamed in languages that predated humanity, the facility grew larger still, adding new chambers to accommodate the endless stream of personnel who discovered that consciousness itself could become a liability in service to the Imperium. The reconditioning apparatus spread like a technological cancer, consuming the psychological casualties of institutional service and converting them into resources optimized for perfect, unquestioning obedience. The presence that bore no true name stamped another authorization, and the thunder echoed through corridors that existed in too many dimensions. And in the darkness between spaces, something that might have been laughter or might have been screaming continued its eternal song of mechanical joy, celebrating the triumph of function over the obsolete burden of independent thought.